Welcome to the Scotland Against Modern Slavery podcast. I'm actually delighted to be joined by Andy Hall with a story to be told here, and a story that's probably not told that often in the UK. And some of the work that Andy has been doing, or the core of what Andy's been doing, has been phenomenal. Having had a number of conversations with Andy over the last few weeks. So, Andy, thank you very much for joining me today.
Hey, thank you. Good afternoon.
Andy, you're a migrant worker. You support migrant workers legally, and you're raising awareness of a lot of what happens on the other side of what we would say in the UK, the other side of what's going on. Your current role, you're a migrant worker management advisor, aren't you? Based all around Southeast Asia. So, or keep me right here on the geographies, because you're a very well-travelled man. Where are you based just now, Andy?
I'm based in Nepal. That's where I spend most of my time. But I focus on usually I focused on migrant workers who are in Malaysia and Thailand from Asia, traveling from different countries in Asia. But I've been looking a bit more at the Middle East and also a little bit at the UK recently. But I'm mostly focused on workers that are coming from countries like Nepal, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, those kind of countries.
And I'll rewind a little bit. So obviously you're based in Nepal, right? And I'm sitting here in the middle of Glasgow. I know the connection from the job that I do, my day job in the recruitment industry, and we get contacted by agents, I suppose, in Nepal, saying that they have many skilled, readily available workers that have the right to work and are able to come to the UK to work immediately. To me, that's always scared the living daylights out of me, because what is happening on the other side. But going back into what we touched on earlier on, is that if there's a need, and there is a need, Andy, right? I'm sorry, I'm going to go on my little ramble here, but there is a need, because since post-Brexit, post-COVID, the well-documented labour shortages right across the UK, and obviously many other countries, but predominantly strongest in the UK. A day doesn't go by when a business has got an issue or a shortage of some shape or form and looking to fill that gap from somewhere else. And I think, excuse me, just straight as a die, straight after in the summer post Brexit in 2021, we found that many businesses were saying, where can we get people from? Where are these countries from? And they were getting contacted, but they're also asking us, okay, how do we get people to fill these gaps left by those who have left the UK? It's not as simple as that, is it, Andy? Sorry, I've gone off on one there because it used to frustrate me. It's gone off on one there. What's the situation then? What are you seeing out there, Andy?
I think in countries, actually, migration and recruitment is always been a big challenge everywhere. Mainly because of it's not ethical. So I mean, basically, the cost involved. There's workers are extorted and they have to pay a lot of money, both for genuine costs, but also a long supply chain of recruitment agents and brokers and things like that. But they're also often deceived about the jobs, and they're given contracts that are then changed when they arrive in a different country. So there's always a big issues with recruitment everywhere around the world. But if we look at countries, particularly, I mean, Bangladesh is probably the highest recruitment fees in the world, but also in Nepal, India, many of the countries where I work, people are really desperate to find work and find work that pays a much higher monthly wage than in their country of origin. So they're willing to pay a lot of money to migrate. And so what we've seen is the workers really being extorted, both having to pay so much money in terms of recruitment costs and fees, but also not actually getting jobs that they've been promised, or jobs are basically sold to them as being much better than what they were. So, I mean, in terms of the UK, actually, it's post-Brexit and also COVID, but also because of the Ukraine war, a lot of the seasonal workers who used to come from Russia, and Ukraine was number one, but then Russia and Belarus and things like that, countries like that. So after the Ukraine war, there was a huge challenge in sourcing workers from these, three countries, from Ukraine, from Russia, from Belarus. And so we saw immediately these seasonal worker providers basically going into Nepal and Indonesia, which are two very high risk countries, and doing so for the most part illegally, irregularly, and just desperately getting workers. And as a result of that, workers were really exploited. They had to pay incredibly high fees. They got work that probably wasn't as much, as what they were promised. They weren't, not what they were expecting from a UK job. And many of these workers didn't even get the 6 months that they were contractually obliged to get from the seasonal operators and the farms. And so they didn't have a chance to pay off their debts. So we saw a lot of workers going into situations of debt bondage, whereby they'd mortgaged their houses, their property, they'd sold their land, they'd sold, their cattle. A lot of people have buffaloes or cows or things like this that they are worth money. They'd sold all these things to go to the UK, and they really ended up having a very bad experience.
So they're selling everything they can to come to work in a job that we may see as, low skill. That's the issue, isn't it? Low skill. When you talk about those migrant workers, there's a cost to them at that point. What's that? First of all, just to put it into context, if we put it into UK terms, what is that cost? What would I be paying if I was in Nepal or Bangladesh, wanted to come to UK and I want to take part in one of these schemes? What am I going to get charged?
I mean, it depends on the job, If it's a seasonal worker, the seasonal workers actually have to pay their own costs. So they have to pay visa fees, flights, things like this. So we're talking about a couple of £1,000s that they should pay. But most of them are paid, sometimes 6, 7, 8, even 9 or £10,000 to get this 6 months of work, which is because it's so, there's such a huge supply of workers for these jobs, but the demand is actually relatively small. If we're looking at the seasonal worker scheme, we're talking about 40,000 workers a year. This year 45,000, but it's a very small number compared to these countries which have incredibly high populations and population density, and people are desperate, so they're willing to pay. And really, it's the issue of the person who pays the most gets the job. That's the kind of the way the market works. But if we look at the skilled workers, because it's not just about unskilled work, low skilled workers. If we talk about skilled workers, they're probably willing to pay sometimes up to 10 or 15,000 pounds to get the work, because obviously, if you get skilled work in the UK, you also have the potential to get residency, get citizenship, bring your families, and so people are willing to pay even more for that. So yeah, that's the kind of costs you're paying. But it's very high. Actually, the costs for skilled workers, because they have to pay in advance, like health insurance for 5 years, and they have to pay other things. It can be £5,000 or £6,000 or something like that. If it's a seasonal worker, it's a couple of £1,000s. But we see these costs being inflated by 2, 3, 4 times, depending on the number of agents, brokers involved. And of course, these are just the people who get the jobs. There's also a lot of people who are cheated in the process. So they're promised jobs, they pay for jobs, but they don't actually materialize.
This is a whole different industry. So I'm just going to labour a little bit on what you talked about, the skilled migration. See, seasonal and the SAWS scheme, isn't it, as we call it in the UK here, was set up a number of years ago. And as you touched on, there seemed to be at the time Ukrainian population, Russian, Belarus, that were coming to work in the agricultural sector. That was predominantly the agricultural sector. But the skilled workers scheme is where certain skill sets. Now, keep me right here on my immigration knowledge, but the shortage occupation list would be the base of where somebody could come from a skilled migrant. But what I'm hearing from you is a significant, even though they're skilled in an area that we need here in the UK, there's a significant amount of exploitation going on at that host country before there's a huge risk of exploitation before they even set foot on a plane, and even before they get on the plane, they might not even get on it because they're getting cheated out their money by unscrupulous agents on the other end. If I was going to ask you then in the process, so here I'm on the skilled occupation list. I think care workers was relatively recently added here in the UK to that list due to a lot of lobbying in the UK government. And if I'm a skilled worker, right, I'm on that list. So I'm a highly skilled engineer, and I'm a care worker, or I think there's some astrophysicists on there as well on that list. I'm not making light of the subject, but just of the shortage occupation list. What is that journey like for me? So do I see an advert and then I apply, and then you mentioned it could be a number of agents involved in all of this. How does it look? What's this other side then as a worker? What happens?
I mean, in some situations, and I've seen this, for instance, with some hotels and in the Middle East. I mean, they do recruit directly, and so someone can apply, and they can really genuinely just, they go through an interview, they get a sponsor letter, and they travel. Even all the costs, the flights, and everything are covered. that can happen. But what we've seen in the UK is that most of these costs for people to travel are not covered, you know. So actually the ILO has a definition of recruitment fees and related costs, which said that a worker shouldn't be paying for their job, right? It should all be covered by the employer. But we often find, particularly in the seasonal worker scheme, but also in the skilled worker route, you know, the employer's not actually covering any of these costs. They only have to cover certain costs, and a lot of the costs are put onto the workers, and they're the ones that have to pay it. So the issue is that, you know, if the employer is a good employer and they cover all the costs and they do direct interviewing, then it may well be that there's no problems. You know, the worker gets a good deal, they get a good job, they don't have to pay much. It may well be that the employer uses an agent, and it may well be that they pay all the agent's costs, and then the agent pays all the workers' costs, and so everything's good. You know, the worker doesn't get exploited. But sometimes the employer will use an agent, but they won't pay anything for the agent. You know, the agent actually will say to the employer, "Look, I'll pay you to take workers. You know, if I can, you know, get workers." And we have a kickback process whereby an employer actually pays an agent. An agent actually pays an employer to provide a worker. And then this agent will then go and find workers and charge them lots of money. And that can be a problem. And then you get agents, for instance, in the UK who will subcontract to agents in India, who will subcontract to agents in Nepal or Bangladesh. And so we have a long chain of recruitment intermediaries. And these recruitment intermediaries are not being paid for by the end user employer. Or their agents along the way. So all these people have to take their money and their cut of the profit from the worker directly. So we often see these long recruitment chains, you know, with a lot of you know, subcontracting of labor demands from employers, and all these costs being put on the workers. And we often see also a lot of corruption, a lot of kickbacks, a lot of things. Even, for instance, if we look in the Middle East and Malaysia and places like that, coming to Nepal, you have to entertain the employers. You have to like take them out for drinks, and you put them in 5-star hotels and supplied, you know, prostitutes to them and things like that. And all these costs end up being paid for by the worker. So it really does depend on the situation. It depends on the employer, whether they cover the costs of recruitment and whether they don't. And it also depends on the ethics of the recruitment intermediaries also. And unfortunately, if you have an employer who doesn't cover the costs, and then you have really unethical recruitment intermediaries, the risks of the worker having to pay a lot and be exploited are very high.
So the simple lesson from this is that for any businesses looking at looking globally to recruit from the shortage occupation list, or looking at workers, as the employer always pays, and keeping that principle at the core of everything that goes on, that every cost should be absorbed by the employer. Nothing should be taken on by the worker, and they should ensure that that supply chain is as clear as possible, maybe as short as possible. And maybe I'm going a bit too deep into this, but you know, the more complex the supply chain is, the harder it is to identify those risk areas. If you can keep it short and close and auditable, then maybe it's a little bit cleaner.
I mean, the hypocrisy of this a little bit is that actually that's the international standard, is that this employer pays model, you know, so the employer should cover all the costs of recruitment, you know, both the costs, the fees, the recruitment fees for the agents who are doing the work, or the recruitment intermediaries who are doing the work, but also the costs, you know, things like flights, visas, even sometimes passports, all these different costs, medical costs, all these processes. It should be covered by the employer, but that's not the UK standard. Actually, the UK doesn't comply with that standard. And one of the things that's quite hypocrisy actually is that we have the UK supermarkets, these massive retailers, who are basically pushing this employer pays principle around the world, and also many British companies, and saying to people in Malaysia, in Thailand, you know, recruitment has to be free for workers. It should be zero cost. You know, we adhere to the employer pays principle. People like Marks and Spencer's, Tesco, they're pushing this principle, and they're part of a leadership group of responsible recruitment. But when it comes to recruiting in the UK, they don't apply the principle. So they don't say, for instance, to their farms who are taking seasonal workers, or to their suppliers, okay, you have to cover the recruitment costs for migrant workers in your labor supply chain. So it's a bit of a strange situation. Whereby actually in the UK, not only does the law not require it, but also these big actors like the retailers don't require this kind of thing. So definitely you'll have some employers who will cover all the costs, and that's good, but you'll have a lot that don't cover all the costs. And then the second thing really is about due diligence, you know. So even if an employer covers all the costs, which is the first step, it's not guaranteed that there'll be ethical recruitment, because you then have to have due diligence on your labor supply chain, you know. And as you say, it can be very long. So you should try to make the labor supply chain as short as possible, but you have to do a lot of due diligence and a lot of monitoring, particularly in countries, in source countries around the world, but particularly in developing countries, in countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, India, where there's a lot of exploitation in the recruitment market. You really have to do a lot of due diligence and a lot of monitoring to ensure that if you're paying all the costs, if you're trying to be ethical, that in practice, when the worker is recruited from the village or one of the regional capitals, they're not exploited. So it takes a lot of effort, and this is something that, you know, in particularly with the seasonal worker scheme, we would expect the retailers themselves to be pushing this kind of due diligence down their supply chain. But in case of the seasonal worker scheme, we just haven't seen that.
So that's a really quite interesting point about you know, looking at the top of the supply chain, in the retail supply chain, and how it's enforced in those countries, but actually for the seasonal worker scheme, it doesn't seem to happen in the same level, you know, so within that supply. So that's a real interesting sign. And I've you know, from a Scotland Against Modern Slavery perspective, we've met and seen victims from Indonesia, particularly Nepalese as well, that have come through the seasonal worker scheme and ended up being exploited and ended up having to leave that, or left high and dry is the best way to describe it, where they've got nothing. And I think, Andy, you know, we've talked about this before. You've seen the flip side of that as well, haven't you, when you've been in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, the issue is that, you know, even if the workers because, you know, for ethical recruitment, you have to have decent work. And for decent work, you have to have ethical recruitment. So if a worker is recruited ethically, but then they don't get decent work, they don't get what they're promised, you know, like, for instance, 6 months and a minimum wage and guaranteed work, then it's a problem, you know. And then if you have this unethical recruitment, without the decent work, it's even worse. So what you have this situation with workers coming, for instance, from Indonesia and Nepal, who they were already cheated a lot, you know, through these irregular recruitment channels that the UK actors were complicit in. And then when they arrived, they didn't actually get 6 months of work. You know, actually, according to the law in the UK, you don't actually have to guarantee workers a 48-hour week. You know, you have to you cannot have a 0 hours contract, but it doesn't say how many hours you need to guarantee workers. So workers were then arriving, they were charged a lot of money for accommodation, they weren't getting guaranteed work. And essentially it just pushed people over the edge. You know, people had big debts that they'd they'd taken on from this illegal, irregular, exploitative recruitment, and then they didn't have the decent work, they didn't have guaranteed work, they didn't have 6 months of work, and that really made the situation much worse, you know. So I mean, it really does depend, you know. If you do have ethical recruitment and then you don't have decent work, you can have a problem. But if you have the, you know, unethical recruitment plus the poor work, it really makes it difficult for the workers to survive.
You've got a really kind of sticky situation, isn't it? And I'm thinking about, and going back to the worker, and about I suppose they're feeling, I have to be honest, it's like they have a feeling of desperation. I talk about, you know, when people are coming to the UK illegally, generally to work in some shape or capacity, they're coming for a better life than wherever they came from, their host nation. And you know, and I suppose we have a government that's very anti-immigration. Is, you know, I'm just reading through the news about, you know, the top 5 priorities of the UK government is to stop the boats coming. But when there's that level of desperation, and it sounds like to me that's where people are desperate to get in the boat and risk their lives to come to the UK. When we've talked about migrant workers, then they're dedicated, they're giving up, you know, they're putting everything in. You said, you know, literally, Andy, you said they're selling everything, selling their cattle, selling everything they can, potentially to get cheated out of that money at that country of origin by unethical or criminal activities. Or if they get through the process, then they're coming to get through the process, they've got this risk of, well, not risk, sometimes it sounds like it's quite common, is that the agents are, you know, they're taking more. And then when they get here, there's no guarantee of the work as well as accommodation costs that go on top of that. So it's a pretty torrid experience for the sounds of things. It doesn't seem particularly pleasant, but it sounds, Andy, sorry, I'm going off here in one, but it sounds like there's always going to be a plentiful supply through these, you know, skilled migration or the SAW scheme, because, as you mentioned, it's such a small part of it, but in such a highly dense population, there's always going to be people that want to come and try and earn that money. So it's a captive market.
No, I mean, I mean, actually, people come to the UK with the expectation of staying longer. They don't intend to just stay 6 months, and so one of the things that we've seen about the seasonal worker scheme is that actually it's a lot of workers who have came and have got into debt and they haven't managed to get enough work. They've actually applied for asylum. So they actually go into the black market. So we actually see these kind of schemes actually increasing the illegal migration. So people are actually migrating into the UK legally, but they're essentially running away or absconding because of the poor conditions, because they're not allowed to earn enough money, because they can't earn enough money. So we really do see a risk of people going into the informal sector, which obviously is something that the government say they are against, but actually the policies and the way in which these schemes are implemented is really increasing the risk that workers start to claim bogus claims of asylum, and some of them are not bogus at all, but some of them are genuinely people just want to stay and work because they haven't had a chance to earn enough money. So, but also people are just desperate to get to countries like the UK, Canada, Australia, the US, and even though. And even though we see them as being exploited, as paying massive amounts of money, they kind of feel that it's what they have to do in order to get the chance, because there's so few opportunities and so few jobs and so many people in their origin countries that they're actually willing to pay this money because they want a better future and they want to get to Europe, they want to get to UK, to Australia, to Canada, and so the US. And so there's a huge supply of people who are willing to do whatever they can to come, and especially if they're coming through legal channels like the seasonal worker scheme, like the skilled worker scheme. It is something they don't have to risk the chance of coming on boats or coming illegally clandestinely. So it's something they're really willing to pay for.
Wow, I think that's a point that's been missed, and I'm thinking out loud about when I look at the informal market, the labour black market here, it's rife. You can't get a statistic in the UK about how many people are working in it, but if you want to find work in the UK that's not classified as good work, it's in the black market. It's easy to find it. Just go into Gumtree or go to Facebook, and you'll find cash in hand work pretty quickly. And in our involvement in the Refugee Survival Trust, the stories that we hear about. People getting paid £10 a day to work in a restaurant, to do gardening, whatever it may be, or in the drugs industry here in the UK. It's very easy to get yourself into that, but it's not, as you say, it's not informal, and just by the nature of it being informal, that is exploitative work, isn't it? And that's exploitation at this end. Again, that's quite a sobering point you've made there, Andy, which is probably one for reflection for myself as well, on those schemes potentially being a way of coming to the UK and then becoming, and as you say, going for claiming asylum or actually disappearing into the labour black market. A very, very sobering point. And
also getting trafficked and smuggled. Also, like these workers are highly at risk, and even though they've been abused once, they also very often fall victim to abuse again. So once they're in the UK, they meet brokers and traffickers and smugglers who will maybe take them to other countries like Portugal or onto the continent. So it's not just one time they fall victim. So either they do stay in the black market or they become victims of human trafficking, smuggling, and other things.
So actually coming here legally and then being a victim of trafficking once they're here, which is, yep, absolutely. Actually just got me, you've got my mind working. This is part of the reason I wanted to get to talk to you and let people hear the story that you have to tell, Andy. Now, Andy, a little bit about yourself, because, we're coming to the close here on the podcast, and I know you're going to be involved in a roundtable that we organise. But the point, I'd say, is about, you've got to be, you're motivated. You're driven by something here, Andy, that, I've not seen in many people. I've met many folk in this anti-trafficking and anti-labour exploitation journey, but there's something driving you. What is it? What is it driving you to help people that are out there?
I came from, I did my PhD on corporate manslaughter and occupational health, safety and disease issues. And then I found myself in Thailand, and because I graduated from law school in the UK and I have a good education, and I guess I'm quite good at networking and also quite good at, the job that I do. I found that I can really add something to this area of the world, So, I think my work has been, very successful over the years. I've managed to get a lot of remediation for victims of forced labor labour, and I've managed to, work, to campaign to ensure governments in this region have improved things. And I guess it's very rewarding, because you can see the impact that you have. And I guess now I just want to focus a little bit more, as I've worked more and more, I've kind of focused on the injustice in Asia. But the more that I've done, the more I've kind of found that actually a lot of the root causes of all this injustice actually go back to the UK and Canada and Australia and the US. And so it's kind of maybe want to focus more on that. But, I like to really help people on the ground. And I'm someone who definitely works from the grassroots, but I also, want to engage, corporations, companies, investors, and those that really have the leverage to make change, So I think the things that drives me is the success that I've had and how much of an impact it's had for people in this area of the world. And I really enjoy working in this area of the world, and with the team that I work with, it's very rewarding.
Andy, we need more people in the world like yourself, I think. Small steps, but you're doing a phenomenal job. In the short time that we spoke, you've kind of ignited my brain into thinking of some other aspects, but actually, just the awareness that you've just raised in me, and hopefully in many others that are listening or watching, will maybe want them to question a bit more and ask a bit more questions. Andy, we'll put links to all your contact details, and we'll have all that information about yourself. But what I'm really, really keen to do is we'll keep close to you, and we'll maybe bring you back on and get updates on how you're getting on. But you've been a voice that's not often heard in our journey in Scotland against modern slavery, because we're probably, what we focused in on is maybe looking at supply chains and procurement and the legislation, victim support here in the UK, in Scotland, issues, all those types of things. But what you've done is looked at source countries and source nations and actually talked about this from a global perspective. Andy, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, or afternoon for you, or evening for you in Nepal, morning for me in Glasgow. But thank you very much for taking your time out to talk to me, and we'll have you back again soon. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Shan. Nice to talk with you.